So lately I've been using a really interesting technique to chop up drum samples on my SP-404. I do use my DAW quite a bit, and I really love Logic for creating music, but the 404 has become a really indispensable part of my music creation process. And it's because of techniques like this that allow me to explore musical possibilities. And really that's one of the reasons I love using hardware, and the 404 in particular, is because it leads me to create musical results that I really wouldn't have come up with otherwise. So one of the reasons I like using this drum chopping technique is because, to me, it's a lot easier than finger drumming. And there are lots of people out there who are really good at finger drumming and they can do really amazing things. But I'm not particularly good at it, and more importantly, when I do it, I have trouble creating interesting drum grooves. With a lot of the music I make, I like to have the drums that are a little bit off the grid, meaning that each drum hit is not necessarily going to fall exactly on a quarter note or an eighth note or something like that. And for me, that's really hard to do with finger drumming because I might be able to get some stuff off grid, but I can never do it consistently, and it always just sounds a little jerky and off. This technique that I've been using allows me to get that off-grid sound in a really consistent and even way that sounds really good. Let's hop over to the 404 and I'll show you how to do it. So the first thing I did just to get started is load up a soul sample and chop it up into a pattern just so we have something to put the drums over. And then I also loaded up a drum loop for us to get started on. And I tried to pick a drum loop that was a little bit loose feeling, so when we chop it up, it'll feel a little more human and interesting. Now from here, I'm actually just going to quickly copy this drum loop over into a different bank, just in case I do some editing to it that I want to go back on. And then I'll take a listen to the drum loop over the pattern just to see if the vibe kind of works. Obviously, we'll need to change the tempo and stuff on that, but I feel like that vibe is there and that's going to work. So before I chop this loop up, I'm going to mess with the pitch and speed of it a little bit just to see if I can find something that sounds cool. And I think it sounds good pitched up by 1/2 step, and I think that speed will get us a little closer to where we need to be for the pattern. So when you first pull up this pitch and speed menu, it's going to be set to vinyl mode, which means when the pitch changes, the speed also changes. And now that I've found a pitch that I like, I want to start changing the speed without changing the pitch. And I can do that by holding Shift and moving this encoder knob. And you'll see that vinyl mode turns off, and below that we have a few different options for different algorithms for changing the speed and the pitch of the sample without changing the other one. So now I'll turn it back up to a 1/2 step up, and I'll start changing the speed while it's playing just to try to get it a little closer to the speed of the pattern. And that's pretty close, which is good enough. I don't need it to be exact because I want it to feel a little bit loose after I chop it up. And before I chop it up, I want to do a couple other things first. I'm going to go into the Start End menu, and I'm going to hit the encoder, and I'm going to normalize it. And that's just going to bring the volume of the sample all the way to the top, so it's as loud as possible. And then this would also be a good point to add any effects, but I think it actually sounds pretty good just like that. The last thing I'm going to do is truncate the end of the sample a little bit so it's a perfect loop before I chop it. So while I'm in the Start End menu, I'm going to use this knob to chop off the end a little bit. And then the encoder will zoom in to where I'm trying to chop there. And while I'm here, I can hit Roll to hear just the end of the sample. And I can even turn on Loop and then hit Roll to see if it's a perfect loop or not. And I hear there's a little gap in there, so I can fix this a little bit. And that sounds close enough. So from there, I'll just hit the encoder, and then I'll hit Truncate, and that'll cut off that end. And now we should have a perfect loop for our sample. So now I'm going to go ahead and chop up the sample by hitting Shift and then the Start End here. You can see the little chop below it. And instead of chopping individual drum samples like a snare hit and a kick hit, I'm actually going to chop this into little chunks. I'm thinking maybe either a beat or 2 beats, and then I'll be able to put those little chunks together to come up with a groove. And since I know I have pretty much a perfect loop here, I should be able to auto mark and just do an even number of chops, and it should come out to something close to what I'm looking for. So let's go to auto mark, and then we're going to turn this time division all the way up to 16 and hit enter. Now this should be pretty close to some good hits here. That sounds pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in and make sure that the hits are right at the beginning of the transients. And I don't really care too much about the little bit of space at the sample when I'm this zoomed in, but I can also just kind of fix it really quickly and easily too. Now this is why I'm going through. You can see how the start point of this one is after the transient. I definitely don't want that. I want to make sure I'm before it. Much better. Cool. Those are all sounding pretty good. So now I can go ahead and assign them to pads. Now I know I've got 16 chops, so I'm going to go ahead and use this auto assign. And I'm going to pick an empty bank and then just turn this knob a little bit. And you can see the auto assign change to the D bank. And I can see that the bank's empty because all the pads are blinking. So from there, I should be able to just hit the mark button. And now those are assigned, I can push the encoder to chop. And that should be it. Now I have all those little drum breaks on each pad. And from here, I want to make sure I add all these to a mute group. So that's under number 8. We'll hit Shift and 8. We'll go ahead and find an empty group. And then we'll add all of them to this mute group. And that way they're all cutting each other off now. And then the other thing I want to do is turn off this gate on each pad because I want the pads to play. Cool. That's sounding pretty good. So now I'm going to go back over to my pattern and start playing it and start kind of messing around on the drums and see if I still need to change the speed of the drums at all. And it may also change the speed of the pattern as well, which you can do while in record mode on the pattern. I can also change the metronome while I'm here as well. It actually sounds pretty great just as it is. It's not quite lined up with the grid and it's got a lot of vibe to it. But I do want to change the speed of each one of these pads just to see if I can find a different vibe that I like more. And the way I can change the speed of all of these pads all at once is by going back into pitch and speed. And when I change these knobs, all I have to do is hold remain. And you can see it'll apply to the whole bank. So I'll go ahead and play the pattern while I'm doing that and see if I can find anything that sits a little bit better. And I think I ended up right about where I was because that sounded pretty good to begin with. But you can see I tried a bunch of different pads because there's different subdivisions on each pad. Some of them have a lot more notes in them, so those are good ones to check just how the pads are lining up with the pattern. And then from here, I'll just hop back over into pattern mode and do some recording and see if I can come up with a cool groove. And then from here, maybe I'll go back over and change the speed of those pads again. And now that I have a pattern actually going, I think it sounds better slower like that. That's got a really nice groove to it. And I can change the pitch here while I'm at it. I'm going to keep that pitch, but I'm going to turn the volume down on all these drum pads by holding remain. I also want to dial in some effects on the third and fourth bus because I feel like that's just an integral part of what makes the 404 sound. And I'm going to do that by hitting Shift and 16, which is his effects setting. And then I'm just going to scroll through some presets while the pattern is playing. I think this could sound pretty good. I'm going to edit these effects a little bit though. So I'm going to use this knob to scroll through to the third and fourth buses. And I want to change this lo-fi effect a little bit. There we go. That sounds a little nicer to me. And then one last thing I want to do is actually take some of those individual hits from the drum loop and maybe create a couple little fills here and there with them. So I'll go back over to my samples and I'm going to take a pad that has a kick and a snare on it. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that over to an empty pad. Then I'll copy it one more time, one for the kick and one for the snare. And then out of those, I'll go ahead and cut a kick and a snare. So I think overall, by taking little chunks of drums, like a beat or two at a time, and stitching those together and doing things like changing the pitch and speed on them is kind of a more interesting way than trying to finger drum in individual hits. And for me, at least, it's a quicker and easier way to come up with some fun sounding drum grooves. So I hope you found that helpful, and I'll catch you next time.